Kyle, come on up here. Hello all, how you doing? I got Kyle running around here like a little maniac. Kyle, why don't you come up and visit us? Huh? You want to come say hello? Come here, Kyle. Here's Kyle. So, just in case you're wondering what a Kyle is, this is a Kyle. Right. This is a special kind of cat. Look at his face. I don't know if he's going to look at you. Now he's going to get all squirrely. Kyle is what's known as a kittler. So just in case you're wondering, you can Google kittler and you can see why Kyle's a kittler. So let's talk the motivated and emotional brain here. Hi, Annika. Everyone's busy now. We're going to have a big party here as we try to do this. We're going to look at neural level phenomenon and its motivational quality. Remember, when we're talking motivation and say what motivates someone, well, we're going to generate a list of potential motivators, not focus in on a single motivator. So in Chapter 3, we're going to talk about brain level motivation. And you might argue, well, all motivation is probably brain level, and you'd be correct in that. But what most specifically is tied to brain level mechanisms, right? So the motivated emotional brain, what do we know? Well, we got the thinking brain, and this is the cognitive intellectual functions. What task it is doing is one way to look at that. The motivated brain is whether you want to do it or not, right? And we all struggle with that level of motivation. How many of you got up? Today is Saturday, and it's like, do I want to do this today or do I not, right? And then the emotional brain, what your affective state is while doing it. So we have the thinking component, the motivation component, the emotional component. One way to frickin' slice and dice it. There are others, but that's where we're at right now. Let us take a look at the structure of a neuron. So I'm hoping for most of you this is a review. This is something that I would talk about in Psych 1100, right? And it's usually in like Chapter 2 or Chapter 3 is the neural exploration. And I don't pretend to be a neuroscientist or a brain expert. That's not my area. I was trained as a social psychologist. But the structure of a neuron, and what is a neuron? Well, you know, we've got, 100 billion neurons between our ears, and the neuron has a very simple job. It's to communicate with other neurons. I know. Good work if you can get it, right? And what we see then is it's the synaptic gap that is really the big story here. We have one neuron here, the cell body, right, of the neuron, the soma, if you will. And you have from the cell body, you have this long tail, the axon, and the axon goes down, and then it doesn't touch the next neuron in line. It uses chemical messengers to communicate from one neuron to the other. So super brief review there. I think one of the unsung heroes of this process is the glia, or the glial cells. And the glial cells, you can see the neuron, they're actually attached to the axon, and they form the myelin sheath, that is the insulation along the axon. But they also, the astrocytes then, are responsible for moving the axon and repositioning it. And it's the repositioning of the axon really that probably represents memory and learning. And that is, as this neuron fires continuously, in Hebbian dynamics, what we're talking about is the potential to fire in the way that it did previously increases every time. So through repetition, right, we develop habit. And what allows memories and habit to occur is the actual rearranging of the synaptic connections, that is, to other neurons. And there might be 1,000, 10,000 synapses for each neuron. This is a complex system. Right, so the glial cells provide the structural support, keep them in position, move them around, and they help form new synapses, new connections that represent new experience, new learning, new memory, and they form the myelin sheath. Now, for the motivated brain, 3 principles. Specific brain structures generate specific motivational states. So, and this is the beauty of neuroscience, and sometimes students will say, hey, Mark, you know, I love psychology, but I'm not sure what I want to study, or I want to go to graduate school in psychology, and I'm pretty flexible in what I'd like to do. And most of the time I'll point people towards neuroscience. Neuroscience is where the big money is being spent now, and where some of the big discoveries are taking place, right? Social psychology, I mean, I love social psychology, don't get me wrong, but I think the field is pretty much filled up right now. Right? And I think it's neuroscience that's growing, behavioral genetics probably growing, but I think social psychology has kind of met its size, and it's going to be stable for a while, and makes it harder to find necessarily positions, right? But if that's what you want to study, that's what you got to study. So specific brain structures generate specific motivational states, and we can begin to see that through our ability to explore the brain. Biochemical agents stimulate the brain structure, and then finally day-to-day events stir biochemical agents. And you might want to look at this then in the reverse order. That is, reaction to stimuli, that is, cause biochemical changes, and those biochemical changes activate certain areas of the brain, and those certain areas of the brain then instigate or diminish motivational states. Now, within the neuron, what we have is a neural impulse, and it's the brief electrical surge. So a neuron basically has a bunch of receivers, and they're waiting. These are the dendrites. And as neurotransmitters hit the dendrites, at some point there's been enough neurotransmitters observed, it tells the brain cell, the neural, to fire. And it sends this electrical impulse down the axon to the terminal buttons at the other end. And the terminal buttons then release neurotransmitters which communicate to the waiting dendrites of the next neuron in line. So it's that electrical impulse, that brief switching from a general negative state to a positive activation, that carries the message through the neuron. Now, between neurons, the message is carried via neurotransmitters, that is the chemical messengers. Electron, don't you do it. All right, now, get down. Go on. They're all going crazy right now. And it's the charged particles that move across the cell membrane that facilitate this negative and positive transformation. So the resting potential, like I said, is a mild negative charge, and then the action potential is the positive charge. Why is this electricity important? Well, you know, when I got to graduate school, 99 and 2000, I remember one graduate student, Jeff Larson, and he was pretty mature in the program. I think he was in his 5th or 6th year, and he was working with John Cacioppo. They were doing attitudes research, but they're doing the research at the neural level, right? And what they would do is look at the firing rates, look at how often these electrical impulses are turning off and on within areas of the brain, and that would indicate which areas of the brain were being affected by the experimental stimulus, right? Strange way to look at attitudes and attitude formation and attitude change, but that's the tools that they had basically available at that point in time. Now, Cacioppo was getting ready to leave Ohio State social psychology, and where was he going? Up to University of Chicago. Why? Because they promised him some Fmri machines so that they could do their brain level, their neural level research, right, with a more sophisticated tool. So the synapse, certainly just remember that neurons don't touch each other. They can't, because then there would be electrical crosstalk. Between neurons, the messenger is the neurotransmitter, the chemical messages. So what does that look close up? Well, okay. So we have the sending end. And imagine the neuron is over here, and it's been told to fire. Its electrical impulse changed briefly from negative to positive. That activates the release of these chemicals, these neurotransmitters. Now, the receiving end of the next neuron is going to, in fact, receive the neurotransmitters, and these little plug-in spots, right? These receptors, they have specific shapes, and they're set up to receive specific chemical messengers. When enough chemical messengers are plugged into the receptor, then this will signal this neuron to fire its electrical impulse, thus activating the next neurons down the line. This to me has always been fascinating, in that everything you've thought, everything you've felt, every profound experience you have, every raging anger that you've experienced is the result of this process. Your appreciation of a piece of art in a museum, or the amazing qualities and how a piece of art affects you is a result of this process. Now, more specifically then, within this context, what does this mean to motivation? Well, for example then, when we look at this motivated brain, or this brain responsible for supplying motivation, food deprivation activates the ghrelin release that stimulates the hypothalamus to create hunger. What? Let's take that maybe a step at a time. So what happens is the environmental event, and note that we can be more general, but we're talking hunger specifically, but it also applies in a more general sense. That is, if my food has been digested and my stomach starts to empty, what happens is that's the food deprivation, or dieting would cause this to happen over a continued period of time, right? What that does is then hormones are released within the system, ghrelin specifically in this case, right? It's circulated in the bloodstream. So as the stomach empties, to indicate hunger then, ghrelin is released in the bloodstream, and then the bloodstream carries the ghrelin up through the brain. And remember, about 60% of your blood is bouncing around in your brain. Your brain is a blood hog. I mean, it's using most of the blood in your body. Crazy to think about, right? Okay, so what happens then is the ghrelin stimulates the hypothalamus, this structure in the brain. And the hypothalamus then is responsible for releasing chemicals to other areas of the brain that tell you, hey, dude, you're hungry. And this is the sense of hunger, right? Now, is hunger a motivation? We're going to be more inclined to call hunger a drive at some future point. But this is how the stomach communicates through the blood to the hypothalamus that sends the message, it's about time for you to eat. It creates the motivational qualities that we associate with hunger, that is wanting food. Now, let's talk a brief overview of the organization of the nervous system. Right? There's the central nervous system, but the peripheral nervous system is where we're going to be somewhat interested now, is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. Now, these are automatic. That is, we don't have a large amount of control over these. These processes operate automatically, and I won't say outside of our awareness because we're often aware of their effects, but the sympathetic nervous system is generally activating us, and that is kicking us in the ass, making us more active, right? So if, like fight or flight mechanisms, if we see a stimulus that might be dangerous to us, it activates the sympathetic nervous system that causes us to be able to run, jump higher, what have you. Now, when we become activated, though, we can't remain in that heightened state of activity forever. We'll burn ourselves up. So the parasympathetic nervous system is able to calm us back down. So note that we have activation, but calming. And this is kind of a model for many of the mechanisms that exist in us as humans. One increases and the other serves to decrease. In this case, the general nervous system activation. Now, if we see a threat, if we see a snake and we become energized, we become activated, we can jump higher or run faster to avoid the snake, at some point we have to relax, and that is when the snake is no longer present or no longer is perceived to present a threat, then the parasympathetic nervous system takes over, calms us down. Now, the endocrine system, and basically the chemicals that our body uses to communicate, generally globally, if they're occurring in the body, right, in any of these glands like the ovaries, the pancreas, the thyroids, the testes, what have you, we're going to call those hormones, and the chemicals that are communicating throughout the body would be known as hormones. The chemicals that communicate between the neurons are called neurotransmitters, right? It's all chemistry when you get to the point at this level. But notice that these organs then release hormones into the bloodstream, which then the hypothalamus is responsible for communicating the message to the rest of the brain. So, Let's take a look then at the emotional brain. Let's take, again, and remember, we're talking kind of this global model that we can get specific at times. Let's say we have an environmental event, unexpected, pleasant event occurs. So something cool happens, right? And then what happens, the biochemical agent then, as the experience of this good thing, dopamine is released, and this is the neurotransmitter released and circulated into the brain circuits. Dopamine stimulates the limbic structures, and as dopamine stimulates the limbic structures then give us the sensation of pleasure, right? So how does it work again? Environmental stimulus causes the release of dopamine. The brain structure then uses the dopamine to say, hey, that was cool. Now, how might this work with gambling? Well, let's suppose I'm drawing to an inside straight. I need one card, right? And I'm sitting here, I put this one card, and I say, I need one. And what I need is I need that 7 because I got 3, 4, 5, 6, and 8. I want that 7. Right? And here it comes. The 7 comes at me. Oh my God. Right? And now what that does is that stimulus causes dopamine, and I'm like happy because I got the card I needed to make the hand I desired. Right? But note that as I'm playing this gambling game, that is, when I experience pleasure, it causes the release of dopamine. And now I learn from the release of dopamine associated with drawing the correct card that this causes me perhaps to want to gamble more in the future. Right? So dopamine is often implicated in various kind of habit-forming or addiction processes. Now, let's take a look inside the brain real quick. Right? 2 ways of looking in the brain back in the day. Surgery, that is, open the skull up, take a look at the brain, and think about it. Some of the earliest experiments, like we open up a frog's brain and they applied electrical current to a certain area and the frog's leg kicked out, and we said, oh my God, check that out. And I said, it appears that this area of the frog's brain, when stimulated with electricity, causes a reaction in the body that is specifically the right leg. And at first we observe it, but then we say, okay, so then I hypothesize that if I apply current to that area again, the leg will kick. So the first time is kind of a freebie and an observation, and based on the observation, we develop a hypothesis. Then we test the hypothesis by recreating the situation and seeing if the hypothesis is confirmed by the predicted response. This is the way brain research was done back in the day. Well, and it still is to a certain extent. If people are experiencing brain surgery, it's often done while they're conscious to make sure that areas of the brain are not being damaged or implicated in reduced functioning by the surgeon's tools. Now, fortunately, much of our research now is able to be done in a non-invasive manner. So we might use the functional magnetic resonance, the fMRI, for example. And this allows us to look at the brain, right, and look at the activity, differences in the activity of the brain in response to stimuli. It also then allows us in experimental neuroscience, that is to craft experiments and say, wow, under this circumstance, if I show these people fear-evoking images, then I expect this area of the brain to demonstrate more activity, and I can observe this in the fMRI machine. It is the future, and the future is here now. And how important is it? When they built the psychology building, right, 2005, 2006, and we had the 100th anniversary of psychology at OSU in 2007. Huge party, 3-4 days of talks, people coming from all over the world who'd been touched by OSU psychology. You know, the big deal was, hey, that basement down there, we're going to put a frickin' fMRI machine in the basement of the psychology building, and we'll be able to develop a burgeoning neuroscience program to train students how to use fMRI, how to interpret it, and how to create experiments that exploit the ability to see activity of the brain via the fMRI. But right off the bat, I want to go back to this idea of my buddy Jeff Larson in graduate school. He didn't have an fMRI machine. Cassiopo and his students were going to go to University of Chicago to chase that fMRI machine back there around 2000. Here's what Jeff did, though. That is, participants would be exposed to messages, experimental messages, to see how they impacted the brain. And he was looking at the electronic firing rate. That was really the technique that was available to us at that point in time. So you put this fancy shower cap, yes, not really, but each one of these represents an electrode. And this electrode is able to sense the firing rate of the neurons in that area of the brain. Now, when I was a teenager, I got in a car accident, and I remember I wasn't wearing a seatbelt, but it was not a big deal back in 1975 to be all like wearing seatbelts everywhere. It wasn't the law. I mean, they existed in the car. And it was a head-on collision, and I got tossed inside the car right up to the windshield. And I remember the rearview mirror, I hit my head on the rearview mirror, put a big gash in there, and when the paramedics came, you know, they're like, oh, well, okay, so you can get up, etc. We don't need to take you to the hospital. But they said, you need to go to the hospital, and you need to have your brain looked at. You need to get like an EEG. So I went to the hospital, and they performed an EEG. But back in the day when they did EEG, it didn't look like this. It was old school EEG. What they basically did is put one electrode on this side, one electrode on this side, and they were simply going to compare the firing rate between the two hemispheres. Very gross judgment. And at that point they said, yeah, the firing rate is slightly off center, evidence of a minor concussion, etc. Nothing that needed to be treated, just needed to recover on its own. But look at the sophistication here. And what you can imagine then, as they increase the number of electrodes, you would get a more precise measure of which areas of the brain were being activated, not just one hemisphere versus the other. So this electroencephalograph, and I remember Jeff would come in and he would present his research to us, and then he would talk about his results, and he would say, and you can see the event-related potentials here, and he would describe what all the shit means, and we're all freaking social psychologists. He was a freaking specialist, right? And we're like, okay, yeah, we'll take your word for it. What's the bottom line? What did you find, right? We didn't necessarily understand this. And this is pretty sophisticated training to be able to understand these. But what I do know and what I can say is each line corresponds to an electrode. And over time, the firing rate is being measured at that electrode, which represents the firing rate at a given area of the brain. One thing we can say is, wow, this right here, P1, REF, right? Look at that, man. There's a lot of activity right there. But at the same time, we look at over the same time, this area of the brain, there seems to be little or no activity. So this then points to certain structures in the brain that are being affected by the stimulus in real time. So, it takes quite a bit of skill to interpret. Not that fMRI results don't take an equal level of skill to interpret, but I think they tell us more. So windows on the brain scans of various types, maybe a CT scan. The problem with CT scans is they're kind of dangerous. It involves a lot of radiation, and this is not something that we should have repeated exposures to. PET was the positron emission tomography, still not used to the great extent. MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, has become the gold standard. And have any of you ever had an MRI? I'm sure, you know, we got a class of what, about 160 this semester, which is crazy for this class. It's a lot of students. Man, if we were in the classroom, we would have to be in a different classroom. We're usually in journalism 300 for this class. It's only got like 95 seats, so we would be almost double that capacity. Fmri machine, what does it look like? Well, it looks a lot like that. You lay down, you got to be perfectly still. It runs you into that tube, and it's a big magnetic, you know, this is a big circle, and it's noisy and scary and all this good stuff, and you got to hold real still. But man, it sure gives us a great picture of the brain. So, great machine. I mentioned the 100th anniversary of psychology at Ohio State, and I remember one of the keynote speakers said there's two things that we need in psychology sooner rather than later. And they said, number one is we need to collaborate. You guys, you social psychologists need to start working with the developmental psychologists who are working with the neuroscientists who are got to work with the clinical psychologists. You guys got to start collaborating because you have so much to contribute to each other's understanding. That was number 1 on the wish list. Number 2 on the wish list is we need an Fmri machine the size of a football helmet. And the idea is once we reduce the technology, hey Penelope, to the size of a football helmet, people can go about their day-to-day business and we can record their brain activity in a more natural environment. It's one thing to put people in here and show them things on a TV or a computer monitor. We can present them stimulus like that or auditory stimulus. But what about having 160 people in the classroom all don their fMRI machines and look at the brain activity in response to, let's say, the communication of a lesson plan? Wow. So it'll happen, right? Because we got frickin' cell phones that are more powerful than computers that used to take up a room. So we will miniaturize it successfully, and we'll learn ever more about this psychological science. Let's talk about the structure of the brain. Okay, the 3 layers of the brain. We have the brainstem and cerebellum. They drive vital functions such as heart rate, breathing, digestion, and largely non-conscious outside of awareness type functions. We got the limbic system that is thought to add emotions to us, complex motives, increased memory abilities. And then finally the cerebrum. This is the crowning glory. This enables reasoning, planning, creating, problem solving. Here's a great picture. What do we have? Okay, we have the brainstem, we got the cerebellum, we got the limbic system, and then we got the cerebrum. Okay, I'm going to show you another picture. This other picture is maybe a little easier to understand visually. So what do we have here? Well, we got the limbic, we got the cerebellum, and we got the cerebrum. Okay, and we got the brainstem. So the limbic system is this area in the center, like the hippocampus, hypothalamus, all these good things. We got the cerebrum, which is the problem solving and higher level thinking. We got the cerebellum back here. Why is it called cerebellum? It's called cerebellum because that's Latin for little brain, and they said this looks like kind of the entire brain but only in miniature, so that's the cerebellum. And down here is the brain stem. And we see that some of the simplest and oldest creatures on the planet have little more than a brain stem. And then we see more sophisticated creatures, but still old in the evolutionary game, that have cerebellum, and they're capable of movement, etc., and this coordinates movement. Then when we see emotion responding, which is in more sophisticated species, we have the limbic system, and then finally in the what we might consider the most cognitively advanced species, then we have the cerebrum. Also, why is this arrow pointing at that? Well, that's cerebellum. That's one of our cats, and she's named Cerebellum. Mostly because when we got her, we said, doesn't that look like our cat Brain? And Brain is a fully mature cat, right? But Cerebellum came in kind of as an adolescent, kind of as, a little beyond kitten. And I said, well, doesn't she look like a little Brain? Oh, then her name should be Cerebellum. So that's Cerebellum. Just in case you needed to know that, which you didn't, but so. Now, the damaged brain, physical damage to the brain, right, might be evidenced in terms of epilepsy. And this is a brain disorder that's marked by seizures and perhaps loss of consciousness, both caused by out-of-control electrical activity. So often what's implicated is the myelin sheath that insulates the axon is supposed to keep that electrical signal within the neuron, right? Damage to that might allow some of the electricity to escape and activate other neurons, which is not what's supposed to happen. Neurons are supposed to activate each other through the transfer of neurotransmitters. So epilepsy. There can be lesions, and this is physical damage that causes changes in the brain or dysfunction in the brain. And from your Psych 1100 class, I would be surprised if you didn't hear about Phineas Gage, who had that pole run through his brain and did damage, especially in the limbic system and the frontal cortex, caused him to become aggressive in those years. And then, I don't know, this is a sad story, but public service announcement, if you will. We look here, and we look at evidence of fetal alcohol syndrome. So if you look at this brain here, this brain is the normal brain of a baby about 6 weeks old. And the comparison brain is a different 6-week-old whose mother was an alcoholic, and the baby was born then with what's called fetal alcohol syndrome. And we can see that the mother's alcohol consumption interfered with the development of the baby's brain. And we see the devastating consequences of that. Drinking while pregnant is controversial. If you go to France, they're going to say a glass of wine or two doesn't hurt while you're pregnant. A lot of other people, in the United States, there's a group of people that say, oh my God, you must avoid alcohol in its entirety while you're pregnant. Some people try to strike a balance, but significant alcohol use has a profound effect on the brain. And one thing they find is a lot of the loss of material in this brain is in the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex is the area of the brain where it allows us to inhibit behaviors. So I might get angry, right? But my prefrontal cortex says, well, it would be against the law to strike out at this person, or this is not something I want to do. It's not part of my value system. This is not a correct response. So the prefrontal cortex is thought to be the seat of inhibiting behavior. And I just want to float the idea here at the moment that inhibition is a form of motivation. It's a motivation not to do something. So I might have an impulse that's driving me to do something, but a robust, well-trained prefrontal cortex says, no, don't do that because it wouldn't be right. It would be harmful. It would be dangerous. It would be risky. So not doing something, I really want to kind of put that right out there right now, that not doing something demonstrates a level of motivation as well. Motivation to inhibit a behavior, not just follow the urge, right? Let's talk a tad about arousal as a motivational state, right? And arousal-oriented brain structures. So the brain structure that might be associated with arousal in some cases is the reticular formation. And it's associated with a motivational or emotional experience of arousal. And what we see then is the reticular formation is an ancient part of the brain. It's down in the brain stem. And let's see how it operates, right? Because it's going to send signals that especially affect waking, sleep, that is waking from sleep, and motor activity. So let us then do a demonstration with a cat. Are you surprised that I'm using the demonstration of a cat? What happens is the cat is asleep, but even in sleep, we're monitoring the outside of environment. Now that differs depending on the individual, but in this then, the cat, right, the ears are monitoring the outside of the environment, and the ears then activate the reticular formation, and the reticular formation then causes the cat to wake, and the cat then integrates this information with their current environmental, and they're reacting and then being driven to a response. So the reticular formation is operating outside of awareness, but pushing that is information to the brain, to the conscious brain, and it's saying things like wake up, and it could be opportunity, it could be threat, but something has activated the reticular formation, which then causes this very low level motivational process, if we want to call it as such. So two really kind of major motivational forces are forces that move us toward or activate approach-oriented behaviors versus those which then cause retreat-oriented behaviors, avoidance-oriented behaviors. Let's look then at the various areas of the brain that instigate approach or avoidance. Now in this case, the approach-oriented brain structure, like the hypothalamus, pleasurable feelings associated with feeding, drinking, and mating occur in this and allow us to approach those kind of stimuli. The medial forebrain bundle, pleasure and reinforcement, and reinforcement is going to be really important in the development of habit, that is, in response to rewards. The orbital frontal cortex is learning the incentive value of events and making choices. Now, interestingly, psychopaths have a relatively robust, just like we do, kind of orbital frontal cortex that they learn incentives. But unfortunately, the other side of this is learning from punishments, right? Which we'll look at in a moment. The septal area, pleasure center associated with sociability and sexuality. The nucleus accumbens is pleasurable experience of reward, a hot spot for liking. So we've been able to determine that certain brains have with them, certain areas of the brain have with them motivational components at this neural level. So this is for approach-oriented structures, right? A couple more then. Anterior cingulate cortex, mood, volition, making choices. Cerebral cortex, making plans, setting goals. And those of you who take any course in kind of this brain level science, you're going to learn this to a great degree. I talk about it for 3 minutes. You can devote a whole course to just these ideas, right? The left prefrontal cortex, approach motivation, emotional tendencies. But let's go and let's look at some avoidance areas. So the right prefrontal cerebral cortex, withdrawal motivation and emotional tendencies. That is backing up, or backing off. And the amygdala, and we hear a lot about the amygdala, detecting and responding to threat and danger. And the amygdala is especially important in this, is thought to be the seat of fight or flight, right? And there's other mechanisms that determine whether fight or flight would be the best response in a given, but it's sourced out at the amygdala, right? And the hippocampus, behavioral inhibition system during unexpected events. Why is this important? Because if something is happening and I'm not necessarily clued into what's happening, it's like, oh, what the hell is going on, right? Well, the hippocampus can say, hold up. The behavioral inhibition says, wait, and allow more processing to take place before we respond. We'll talk about this behavioral inhibition system more further in the course. Tremendously important idea. It's known as abbreviated as the BIS, B-I-S, Behavioral Inhibition System. But let's focus on the amygdala, such an important area of the brain, right? Two purposes of the amygdala. It detects the aversive characteristics of environmental objects. And the amygdala is a non-conscious processing device. And so it tells us, it alerts us to potential danger, potential threat. It relays emotion-laden information in neighboring cortical and subcortical regions. It detects also and allows us to respond to beneficial stimuli, assesses the reward processes of identified stimuli. Right? So it says, oh my God, you better pursue that because it's interesting. So we've got a lot of approach and avoidance tied up with the amygdala. Let's see how this works in kind of a very general sense, processing fear. Okay? So we have the brain, we need the brain. And let's put some eyeballs up front here. So this is eyeballs are stimuli receptors. That is the rods and cones in the eyes receive electromagnetic energy, detect the electromagnetic energy, and then transduce that to neural impulses, which travel along the optic nerve to various brain areas to allow our eyes to communicate to the brain. Okay. So we have a stimulus, and we have a snake, right? And we have the electromagnetic energy, that is light energy, hitting the snake. It's reflected in a pattern based on the pigments in the snake. The eyes then take that electromagnetic energy and they turn it into a transduced signal of neural impulses that send it along the optic nerve. First place it hits is the visual thalamus. Now, this is an area, right, that's in the limbic system, and we don't have conscious access to the visual thalamus. It's a non-conscious device. The visual thalamus bleeds some of the signal off and sends it straight to the amygdala. This is a very fast system, and it's operating non-consciously. The amygdala says, holy shit, that is a snake, and it activates through the brainstem, the motor cortex, jump, back up, stop, freeze, what have you, whatever the patterned response, whatever the learned response has been. So, super fast system for super fast threat assessment and threat response. Notice, this has all occurred outside of conscious awareness. Now, the signal continues on from the visual thalamus back to the primary visual cortex. Now the visual cortex is slower, but it's going to do more effective processing, more complete processing of this signal. What's going to happen here? Eventually, this snake will now be brought to conscious attention, and we will see it, if you will, right? And be able to consciously process it. Based on that conscious image then, this information is fed back to the amygdala kind of as a verification system. What we have though, and at this point we might say, oh, actually in discerning this isn't a real snake, this is a rubber snake, and the threat doesn't exist any longer. Okay? So, here's the deal. This is super fast, non-conscious. This is conscious, but slower. We are blessed with a brain that operates both quickly and more slowly. Less detail, but quicker responding, which can have tremendous survival benefits. And more refined processing to then kind of add more information to the process. It's cool. Two systems that are operating in parallel, right? So, the amygdala then, the threatening event causes amygdala stimulation. It releases neurotransmitters like dopamine, serotonin, noradrenaline, nature's speed, kicks us into high gear, right? Acetylcholine that allows the system to slow back down, implicated in the parasympathetic system. The amygdala is one of our best friends. It really has your back. And in Psych 1100, I often tell students, look, the brain has your back. Think about it. When I was growing up, we were told, you only use 10% of your brain. Well, that wasn't true. What was meant to be said at that point in time, right, and this is the 1960s, if you will, and as a child, is you are aware of about what 10% of your brain is doing. The other 90% you don't have awareness of. It's called unconscious. Now, social psychologists in this day and age prefer not to use the word unconscious. We'll use the word non-conscious. Okay, so not a big difference in meaning. We could go down a path and try to differentiate the two, but social psychologists prefer the term non-conscious so we don't sound like Sigmund Freud. Seriously. So, what neuroscientists are finding now with these sophisticated techniques of looking at brain processes, how they're activated and how they're inhibited, is that perhaps 98% of our brain is outside of our awareness. We maybe get to be conscious, and consciousness is involved in maybe about 2% of our brain. Non-conscious processes dominate far and away, and it's not even comparable. So, results of the amygdala stimulation, what do we know? Well, the amygdala becomes stimulated. It stimulates the lateral hypothalamus, because remember, these brain structures are free to communicate with each other, and this activates the sympathetic nervous system, causing us to respond in a way to enter into the fight or flight mode. The stimulation of the paraventricular nucleus reduces stress hormones like cortisol, right? The stimulation of the parabrachial, it causes changes in respiration. And look, these are things we need to do. When we are under threat, when there is a bear running at us, and it looks like, we've determined that bear is going to eat us, we need to get busy. We need to respond to that stressor. So you can see how the amygdala kind of kicks the whole ball off, and it says, let's get busy, folks. It's stimulation of the central gray area, which may then cause defensive behavior like freezing. And it also then releases components that will help with pain suppression, so we're not involved with the experience of pain during the initial act. Remember, often you probably had the experience where something happened to you, you got hurt, but you really didn't feel the pain that intensely until after the threat was removed, and then you're allowed to get the full experience of the pain. Give or take, right? And stimulation of the trigeminal facial nerve, and this is then causes the eruption of the facial expression, the fear facial expression. Wow, there's a lot of brain structures involved with the amygdala kind of doing the assessment and then giving its best guess as to what should be activated and how. Downside to this process, the amygdala is a great communicator, it's a great speaker, but it doesn't listen very well. So there's a vast number of projections, and this is where the brain anatomy becomes so important in understanding it. The amygdala's got all these projections that talk to all these different areas of the brain. But what we see is there's not many projections from other parts of the brain that go back to the amygdala. So the amygdala is like that boss that doesn't listen, right? It tells the employees all what to do, but then the employees say, but boss, and the boss isn't listening, right? And that's kind of the story of the amygdala. Very few projections back to the amygdala. So once the amygdala is off and running, if we become extremely frightened or we become extremely angry, then there's not a lot of areas of the brain that will speak back to the amygdala and say, whoa, put the brakes on, chill the hell out, back off, or whatever the message should be. So it's at least partial explanation why strong emotions, especially negative, overwhelm the cognitive process. And we see then anxiety disorders or excessive fear responding or excessive aggression because the amygdala instigates those processes, but there's, the areas of the brain that would inhibit those processes don't have necessarily the control that they could. So that damn evolutionary process. The amygdala saves our ass, but at the same time, there are cons associated with how it operates. So at this point, I'd probably stop and ask for questions. I'm going to pause for a minute. I'll have a drink of coffee. You guys can consider your questions, but you'll have to come to our session, right, to get them answered if you don't find a way to answer them on your own. So, neurotransmitter pathways in the brain. What does this mean? Well, this cluster of neurons communicate with other neurons by using one particular neurotransmitter. So, different neurotransmitters are capable of coming from different areas. Different areas of the brain have different levels of given neurotransmitters within that area of brain to facilitate different types of responding, to activate different mechanisms. Now, what neurotransmitters might best be implicated in changes in motivational processes? And the relevant neurotransmitter pathways, in this case, really dopamine, serotonin, norepinephrine, endorphin are the ones that really kind of are most directly linked to changes in motivational states. Now, endorphins allow communication between brain areas, right, that are involved in the inhibition of pain. And we know that endorphins are implicated in the runner's high. Right? So for those of you who run, and there's probably a bunch of us who run, I'll ask the question. Often my experience in running is when I start running, it's like, oh my God, I hate this, I don't want to do this, oh my God, it hurts, or I'm tired, right? But after I run a certain distance or for a certain amount of time, then it feels better to be running. That a lot of the pain associated with running, the displeasure, is being supplanted, and you move into this runner's high where you feel like you could almost run for a good deal further or longer, right, once you achieve that state. What that is when we first start running, we start kicking out the endorphins, but they're being administered slowly, and at some point they build up to a certain level where they affect and generate what might be called the runner's high, the inhibition of pain. Endorphins allow for the reduction of anxiety, the control of fear, the generation of counter feelings, that is like good vibes, right? So endorphins are implicated in these motivational states. So for many of us who like to exercise, right, it's like, God, I don't feel like exercising. But the deal is, or I feel sore, but the deal is if we just exercise and give it a good 5-10 minutes, depending on the nature of the exercise, we're going to feel better for having done it. The endorphins kick in, right, and support our efforts at that point in time. But notice, this doesn't get us off our ass to begin the behavior. So endorphins rarely motivate us to get off the couch. They motivate us to continue the effort, but the effort's already been started. Now, norepinephrine, and I called it nature's speed a while back, right? This increases alertness. This facilitates arousal. Right? So the two neurotransmitter pathways, what do we see? Well, we see then what's happening, the functions of the blue lines, rewards. So motivation and anticipation or experience of reward has a motivational property. Pleasure, euphoria, motor functioning, right? And especially fine-tuning of motor function. Not jumping up and down, but fine finger manipulations. Right? This is a favorite of police officers to test sobriety. That is, to what extent can you do this? And notice, this is fine motor control. This would be gross motor control, grasping, right? And notice that's something an infant can do, but an infant couldn't do this, especially if they've been drinking too much. So, now, functions, mood, memory, processing, sleep, right? So the serotonin pathways in red, the dopamine pathways in blue, and then we can see the brain areas, and we're able to begin to map these out with greater and greater detail through our more sophisticated biochemical analysis and tools like the fMRI. So let's talk about dopamine. Dopamine release, right? Emotional positivity, enhanced functioning. So creativity and insight and problem solving. Now note how this might work. Let me put it to you this way, and I'll say it more than once. The chief enemy to creativity is procrastination. And if we put it off and 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 we continue to approach a deadline, we begin to experience greater anxiety about the looming deadline, and it interferes with our ability to be creative, right? Creativity takes a lot of non-conscious processing, so if you want to engage in creative endeavors, plan for it and then allow yourself time, right? And this reduction of anxiety enhances the release of dopamine and allows you to be more creative in that regard, as one example. Now, a lot of times we might want, or we're tempted to say, hey, this neurotransmitter does this neurotransmitter does that, and we'd like it to be clear-cut and single-use kind of explanations. Well, no, there are multiple mechanisms that use dopamine. So, for example, what do we know? Well, dopamine release and incentives, right? Dopamine release and reward, dopamine and motivated action, dopamine and its relationship to addiction, dopamine and its implications in liking and wanting. So dopamine's a busy-ass neurotransmitter in the brain responsible for many functions. Notice that when we're talking psychopathologies, we might be talking dopamine or serotonin imbalances that prevent the brain from operating in the expected or perhaps desired way. So again, certainly more than a one-to-one correspondence from behavior, mechanism to a single neurotransmitter, as we saw with dopamine. Tremendous number of mechanisms associated with dopamine, and a significant number of pathways associated with dopamine and how it's used in the brain. So this is just an example here of the different areas, the different projections, and how the neurotransmitters facilitate the communication between them. Rest assured, on the quizzes, well, you'll see when you take the quiz, that it doesn't go into specific detail of each of these areas. An illustration for you. If you want to study brain-level psychology courses, then you'll be responsible for reproducing this, but not in this class. Let's talk about the hormones, and the hormones that occur in the body that then communicate the body's state. Hormones communicate the body's state needs to the brain, right? So that the brain can then facilitate the fulfillment of those bodily requirements. Essential hormones underlying motivation, emotion, behavior, cortisol, the stress hormone. So when the amygdala kicks us into high gear, fight or flight, what's happening? Cortisol is being released. It's associated with poor intellectual functioning. That is, it's causing interference with some of the inhibitory processes and some of the higher cognitive functions, right? People who undergo stress over a long period of time, it's actually causing their brain to be less effective and less efficient in its operation, right? Testosterone, what's it associated with? High sexual motivation underlies the mating effort and causes us to go out, seek mates, talk, and do all that kind of stuff in terms of mating rituals. Oxytocin. Well, that's a good one to talk about at this moment. It's the bonding hormone. And this is the tendon friend stress model. So oxytocin is also released in response to stress, and this is a relatively new discovery. And it causes us to respond to stressors in less aggressive ways and more nurturing ways. And there's gender differences, but they're also culturally generated. For men, stress often then leads to a fight or flight response, and men have kind of a narrow response menu that they can choose from. Women in our culture can do the fight or flight thing, but they also have the ability to tend or befriend to a greater extent. Now, right now, Annika, what's going on? Annika and I are both experiencing increased oxytocin release at this very moment, right? Because of the affection that we're showing for each other. And one of the benefits of cats is they have the kind of this natural ability to increase oxytocin release in their human partners. So she's getting an oxytocin dump, and so am I as a result of this behavior. And look how happy she seems as. And notice I'm already talking in frickin' baby talk, right? Because I'm petting my damn cat. So we can see the behavioral evidence of this oxytocin release, right? So it motivates seeking counsel, support, right? Nurturance of others during times of stress. So, but I'm not feeling much stress. I don't get too stressed out lecturing to you guys, especially in front of the camera. In the classroom, it's good stress, though, because it activates, it's exciting, and it's channeled to useful purposes. She's had enough. She needs to now chill. It's interesting with cats. They become easily overstimulated. I'd been talking about Cerebellum earlier, and she is very affectionate on her own terms, but if I pet her too much or I scratch her too vigorously, then she might in fact start growling and or hissing, right? Which is a signal to back off, and she's getting overstimulated. You'll notice if you pet a cat and the cat bites you, it's probably because that cat became overstimulated at that point. Now, neurotransmitters, clinical depression. Clinical depression, let's not pin it down to one cause because it's a multi-causal, it's multiply determined when we talk in terms of clinical depression. Serotonin deficiency might be one implication. And notice then medications are derived to benefit a serotonin balance because the serotonin is imbalanced, deficient in this case. Motivation to cope is diminished, so serotonin is implicated in our coping ability, and to the extent that we're serotonin deficient, we may in fact not be able to cope as effectively. Reuptake inhibitors serve to increase the net availability of serotonin, so we might take a drug that causes us to increase the level of serotonin output, but we can also then prevent neurons from taking up surplus serotonin to attempt to recycle it, leaving more available for neurotransmitters. Dopamine deficiency inhibits the experience of pleasure or the anticipation associated with pleasurable activities. So we can look at a neural level for psychopathology, if we would, and see that the neurotransmitters are implicated in it. Right, sweetie? All right, so now, the world in which the brain lives, motivation can't be separated from the social context. And notice, a lot of times we're talking about stimuli that are being perceived, that are being sensed, perceived, processed, and causing changes in neurotransmitter balances through the activation of different brain mechanisms. So even if we take this kind of neural level analysis of emotion, it's tied to responses to environmental stimuli. So we can't leave the environment behind or the outside world. What's important is just understanding how brain level phenomenon affect motivation. It's one place. So when I was saying, hey, why did someone do something? Or why did they do it that way? Or why aren't they doing this? We have an array of potential explanations. We might have 5 or 6 different potential explanations. is it really best a neural level explanation of a neurotransmitter imbalance? Or is it someone's past history with a stimuli? And so we line up this list of causes, and then we look to test each cause to provide evidence for the cause or demonstrate that there's lack of evidence for that particular cause. And then our selection of causes tends to change to a certain extent. So we're not always consciously aware of the motivational biases or basis of our behavior, right? A person is not consciously aware he or she committed a social or antisocial act. My idiot neighbor next door has this tremendous anger and aggression problem. But he's got at least 2 different sources of brain damage. I'm sure he was born with fetal alcohol syndrome, and he's also fallen on his head, right? So when he comes off, and responds in a way that's overtly aggressive and not necessary to the point of actually threatening physical violence or harm, right? Just going off. To what extent is he able to control that? He's not able to inhibit it. And to what extent is he aware of the mechanisms that are causing it? Essentially not at all, right? He does now do kind of anger management mandated by the courts. He got into a road rage incident and produced a gun against some driver who simply, changed lanes. He's now mandated by the court to attend treatment, and it's not going to repair the damage in his brain. That is essentially irreparable, but what it is to develop new coping mechanisms and new inhibitory mechanisms, try to push some of these problems into his consciousness. Okay?
And now for something completely different.
John Cleese from Monty Python back in the day. Great show, growing up as a teenager. Who could do any better than watching Monty Python on TV? So, now for something completely different. We're switching to discussion board 1, which basically has very little to do with what we just talked about. But I want this assignment, and I want to lay the groundwork for this assignment. The assignment is a 2-part discussion board, so you're going to post an initial post, and then you're going to post a response to somebody else's post. Okay? And this is about borrowing an effective strategy from social psychologists called incrementing. And what we're going to talk about is moving towards behavior change, moving towards changing one's motivational state. And you say, well, why the hell, what does this have to do? And that's why I said, now for something completely different. The deal is, what meaningful assignment could I have created out of this biological basis of behavior? And that would be very difficult to do. We don't have access to Fmri machines. No one's got an EEG probably at their home. So, and we're not going to be extracting each other's blood or saliva and testing it for hormone content, the process of neurotransmitters. So let's take a look at this assignment. You're going to use the discussion board as your channel of communication on this. Now, what is this incrementing, and how does it relate to behavior change and behavior acquisition, the formation of habits, if you will? Perhaps the best known example of incrementing used to shape behavior was the systematic creation of anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany. So you don't go from, hey, we're now going to elect Adolf Hitler and as a result kill all the Jews, kill 6 million Jews. You have to move people slowly in the direction you want to get them to change their behavior. So one of the first things that was done was there was a concerted propaganda effort. And notice that most of the people who scream fake news are actually the people generating fake news. It's Freudian, it's projection, right? So the Germans systematically told stories about the Jews to support initially prejudice, stereotyping, prejudice, and then discrimination toward the Jews. So say, oh, those Jews, they're genetically inferior. Oh, those Jews, they're greedy. Oh, those Jews, and the stories become part of the fabric of the German people at that point in time. Oh, the Jews are responsible for the inflation in Germany. Oh, they're responsible for our loss in World War I. And we begin to tell this story about the Jews. And once I have you firmly convinced that Jews are bad, now I'm going to up the game. I'm going to bump it up a notch, like Emerald likes to say. I'm going to increment it and say, because the Jews are bad, because the Jews are this, and technically the Jews aren't humans, they're subhuman, they're kind of like vermin, we're going to stop shopping at their businesses, right? We're going to stop hiring them. If you're a Jewish doctor, we're going to pull your license, right? So we begin to discriminate through these processes. And then we begin to physically attack the Jews, because that's kind of the next step in progression. So we increment until we justify rounding up the Jews and placing them in ghettos, which also is reinforced because now we steal their property they leave behind, or we take over their businesses, right? So there's actually kind of that reward mechanism, and then eventually we exterminate them. You don't get to from zero to extermination in a single step. But what we learn from like Stanley Milgram, who demonstrated no one's going to give the learner a 450 volt shock on the first trial, what we need to do is give the learner a 15 volt shock. And then if the learner makes another mistake, we'll give them a 30 volt. So we'll increment 15. I'm only shocking them 15 volts more than I did last time. It's not that big a deal. It's only 15 volts until we're delivering what would be purportedly deadly electrical shocks. So the system of incrementing this, it might seem impossible to get people from point A to point Z. Social psychologists and behaviorists both have demonstrated that if we do this a step at a time, then we can change behavior of almost anyone to do almost anything. And of course, the Chinese proverb, right, is the longest journey begins with a single step. And it's that step-by-step process that represents incrementing. So I want to explore that in discussion board 1. I'd like you. So do you remember this slide from lecture 1? And this slide says list 5 motivational issues you have. That is problems with motivation. Right? And I asked you to write this down if you want to keep a journal or just a file on your computer where you can kind of enter these things as we go throughout the course. Then list 5 activities where motivation seems to occur naturally, almost without effort. Right? So keep those and let us consider the differences as we move throughout the course. So you got your list, I hope. Right? Now, let's move to discussion board 1, and here are the instructions. So pick one of those 5, one of those places where motivation is an issue for you. That is one of those places where it's difficult to get you off the dime. That is, it's difficult for you to get started. Now, that is the starting point, right? I need to do my homework. I'm sitting on the couch. But what we're talking about is getting to the point of actually doing one's homework. So step A to step Z, right? So identify the opposite situation, that is doing the homework. So I'm not doing my homework, but I want to be doing my homework. Or there's a sink full of dirty dishes, I want a clean kitchen. However, whatever it is. So then 3 potential steps that would lead from the starting point to the target point need to be identified. Now that you have 3 steps, what might be an obstacle to each step being completed? So it's one thing to lay out a plan, and often we lay out plans. Well, I'll go from here to here to here, and then I'll be on my way. But the problem is that if we're really experiencing a motivational deficit, we're very sensitive to the obstacles to each step, and we can be derailed on our path to completion, right, by those obstacles. So here's the deal. It's increasing, and I love the word, the concept mindfulness. This is what I want to do. This is what I want to make happen. But am I aware that I often fall prey to obstacles along the way and they short-circuit my path? Here's the deal. If I'm going to start a behavioral change plan, and it's like, okay, so I want to lose weight. Dieting is a great one, right? I weigh this and I want to get to this weight. How am I'm going to get it to a diet? But notice, we're often short-circuited on our way because we failed to anticipate the obstacle. My hunger is overwhelming, so what do? I just give in to it. Well, it's like, no, I'm going to reduce my portion size in half. That's my first step. But then we don't anticipate that I'm going to feel unsatisfied at the end of the meal. And that is the consequence, and the feeling of lack of satisfaction is going to drive me to eat more. But if I reduce my portion in half and I experience the obstacle of not feeling satisfied, what am I going to do about that? So if we realize that there'll be an obstacle in my path and I think about it in advance, then I may be able to develop a contingency plan to help me overcome that obstacle. So it might run like this. That is, boy, I'm hungry. I'm going to be hungry. I only ate half the plate of food. I ate half my portion. I feel hungry. Oh my God, the hunger is overwhelming, and I cave and I eat more. No. Here's the deal. I'm going to eat half as much, and I realize in eating half as much, it's likely that I won't feel satisfied. Upon that feeling of dissatisfaction or lack of satisfaction, then I'm going to get up and do something. That is to detract myself from the feeling of the lack of satisfaction. That is, I have a contingency plan in place. So I want you to develop the step-by-step process to get from A to Z, and then list an obstacle for each of those steps. That way you're coming in with eyes open, you're coming in with a mindful approach, right? So now develop a step-by-step behavior plan to overcome each of those obstacles so you move from the existing motivational challenge to the desired motivational accomplishment. That is, I know you're going to come at me, body, and you're going to make me feel unsatisfied because I didn't eat enough, but you know what? I got a plan for that, because when that occurs, I'm going to do this, right? So that is, you're always anticipating your own kind of response to the obstacles. Identify then a personality trait that might be a potential source. And that's not necessary that it will be, but it is possible. So, and that might be, I'm undisciplined. And what is the opposite of undisciplined? It's disciplined, right? So then note it in the discussion board, and we'll discuss it in a future discussion board. And then finally, what are you going to do? You're going to read a classmate's post. After they put this, provide them with one caution to their plan. So that is, you're going to pick someone out, you're going to read their plan and say, I like your plan, and you might want to be doubly cautious or anticipate this. So what you're going to do is provide support, agreement, and constructive advice to help them on their way. Okay? You want them to succeed. So let me try an example here and see what you think, right? This is failure to donate money to a charity, and I'm picking out an example. I don't want you to use this example. I want you to generate your own example, so that's why I picked an example that you're unlikely to choose, right? Donating money to charity. Potential existing trait, I'm jumping ahead. I'm selfish. I don't want to donate my money to charity. What's the target trait then? I want to develop selflessness. I want to become less selfish. So, number one, the behavior, and this is, you're going to have your assignment template. I mean, this is your template, so fill this out. I'm going to, either I or our course assistant is going to be grading this, and they're going to look for a complete response to each one of these numbers, right? So, and explicitly label it so it makes it easier for us to grade, please. Behavior, failing to donate money to charity, that's what I'm targeting. I chose this example, right? The target, 2, so my behavior, I failed to donate money to charity. 2, what do I want to do? I want to donate money to charity. Potential steps, well, spend some time reading about different charities and the benefits of donating to charities. Notice this might increase my motivational desire. It might increase my desire once I cognitively engage the idea of donating. B, plan budget modifications and set aside donation amount. So that'd be my next step. First of all, I got to encourage myself to the value of donating to a charity. My next step then is making sure to manipulate my budget in such a way that I actually have the money. And then finally, the third step, finalize increment of change by donating chosen amount to the charity. That is opening the envelope, writing the check, putting it in there, or getting on the correct website with my credit card, whatever it is, right? Now, okay, step 5, carry on. You're almost done. Now, here's where you list the obstacles to each step. I didn't do this. You guys can figure it out, right? By now, you got to figure out what I'm saying. The potential trait then, number 6, we identify selfish, target trait selflessness. Then 7, the response to someone else's post. Hey, buddy, nice choice of challenge. one pitfall you pointed out might be forgetting. That is, you might forget to do your research, and that way you never become motivated. So be specific in suggesting, right? So if you pick something close to home, more meaningful to you, then you're more likely to keep it in mind and probably less likely to, in fact, forget. So notice the response to someone else's post is not extended. That's not where most of your work goes. 90% of your work goes into creating your post. 10% of your work will be responding to somebody else's. Notice the response really has two components, right? That is, well, it's got three components. First of all, it's saying good job, right? So that's the reinforcing quality. And then it's saying one pitfall, pointing out one obstacle to your plan or one problem with your plan might be, and then it's offering a suggestion. So in that case, then you might want to do this, right? Now, please remember that there are two due dates, and Carmen only allows for one due date on a discussion board post. That's the ultimate due date. So your initial post on your honor and your Buckeyes, so I know I don't have to worry about this, your initial post has got to be completed by 129. And then the beauty of doing this and being timely is that you give your classmates time to formulate a good response. So that due date isn't so much for you, 129. That due date is for others. That due date is for your fellow Buckeyes, to give them time to read enough posts to consider making a useful response to somebody's post. And that is the Carmen enforced deadline of February 5th, right? So you be on your honor, and I know you will do well on this. So think about it. Move through it, and notice we got quite a lead up here. We're talking the end of the month and the beginning of next month. So, it's 2 weeks and 3 weeks out there are these deadlines. I'm hoping this is ample notice for you guys. This is the way we're going to work through it. And that's all I got for you. So this neural basis of behavior, let's put it under our belt, explore it, and let's call it the end. It's the end of Chapter 3, and this is a picture of Jilly. Jilly is a cat that becomes easily overstimulated, like I explained to you earlier. Pet Jilly too much, she's going to turn around and bite, and she bites hard, man. She doesn't mean to. It's not something that she can control, right? She's learning to, but she was a stray, and she's got to transition to this domestic life, and it happens a little bit at a time. That is, and what I found with a lot of the cats here, they're all strays, right? Some are feral, some are strays, and slowly, incrementally, they can change their ways and become good citizens in the household. So, and you can see Jilly there is helping me grade. That's one of her favorite things to do. Back in the day when we were grading papers, not so much anymore. So I hope you find some of this useful, and have a great day.